first part of the discussion, Professor Nagpal talked about the background of Toru Dutt and the different interests that she showed in aspects of life, and that shaped her sensibility and her creative character, and this is reflected, of course, in some of the poems that she wrote. So in her poetry, and she also referred to her prose writings, and at the young age of 19 or so, when she would fold up and decide to not exist or die very young. In that small span of time, she is able to capture so many things, and through poetry, through prose, through a value system which is different, through modernity, her interest in modernity, and a very positive kind of an interest, and being a woman, all these things are fused into her writing. And now let's think then about her writings, and I would in fact also request Professor Nagpal to touch upon some of the points that she might have shared earlier in the other series where she talked about her prose. So prose and poetry together, I think, will form a good combination of trying to understand the poetic nature of this person. So over to you.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So, if we actually, since you've raised the point about prose, so here, I would just like to share a few quotes from her letters. So, for instance, she finds the European part of the town to be far better, and she says, sometimes I wish I were out of Calcutta. Calcutta is such a horrid place socially, morally, backbiting and scandal. Her vision is for a more modern Calcutta, she says. And at the same time, in the same breath, she also talks about what she calls the demoralization of English society. So she writes that as for the state of demoralization of English society, I shall neither be surprised at nor afraid of it. Calcutta is a very sink of iniquity, and she says that the saddest thing is that people have a very bad idea of Christianity, and she says that the manners of Bengali Christian society are such as would, at the same time, so she's talking about the converts also. So she says, but let me stop here. The manners of Bengali Christian society are such as would sadden the merriest heart and dishearten the most hopeful. So there is a sense of honesty in her writing. And, later she's quite pleased in 1876. She writes that the coming up of skating rinks, a new zoological garden, aquarium, Calcutta will soon be quite a European city. And that is something that kind of really, pleases her. And but if we kind of get back to, our casuarina tree. So she also, we discussed briefly the trope of memory. So she writes that, dear is the casuarina to my soul, beneath it we have played, though years may roll. O sweet companions, loved with love intense, for your sakes shall the tree be ever dear. So, the fact that, they have played under the casuarina tree is something that, it's etched in her memory. So, here is a writer who's not trying to present a theory, is not trying to present a picture in which there is, which is like a finished product. No, she's trying to create a painting in a sense that has different shades, that has different colors. And each one of them probably, portrays, depicts a certain aspect of English society, at times good, at times not so good. And similarly, at times of Indian society, at times beautiful and at times quite the ugly. So, and all these different strands are there, and it's probably because she's also a very young poet. So it's with complete honesty that she strings together these different strands through images that again emanate from both the English and the Indian context, though one may say that her style of writing is more English, because obviously both the language and the style are not available, to the Indian context. So, a casuarina tree in that sense about memory, about remembering, about the childhood days, and so which is why this tree shall always be dear. And she says that, with your images, it shall arise in memory till the hot tears blind mine eyes. And again, a very, very typically English style of writing, if there is anything typically so that one can call. What is that dirge like murmur that I hear? Like the sea breaking or a shingle beach. it is the tree's lament and eerie speech that haply to the unknown land may reach. So I think with this we probably understand, first of all, what the casuarina tree really means to her, and her childhood, her memory, and how she keeps, even when she's abroad, she keeps thinking about the time that she has spent here. And yet, when you look at her prose writings, read her letters, she writes honestly about what she sees, but she always looks at her own country as a space, and her own city as a space that she wants should become better than what it is. So that there is that kind of hopefulness and optimism that things should improve. So, Professor Prakash.
I was thinking about the Victorian culture that she breathed in, and,
Yes.
and that must have also affected her. So this nature is there in Tennyson, for instance, and Tennyson is closer to her in terms of history and society, or in sense of time, and in England, Romanticism was dying out gradually. But in India, it was emerging as a fresh force. So these things are there, and if you talk about dirge and about sadness and about tragedy, then that tragedy and sadness actually are the kind of characteristic traits of this England at the time when Queen Victoria was at the helm of affairs, and therefore it's a different kind of India that I imagine through her writing. And India that sometimes is seen from the angle of Europe, and sometimes when India is seen as a modern kind of a thing emerging, it's in a seed form, but finally it will go this writer way. So where things are emerging from, where they are leading to, all that is shown in very clear terms in her poetry.
Yes, yes.
And about prose, I am not sure. You have to enlighten me further about that, and the viewers who are listening.
So, prose, in any case, we've already done one lecture
Yes,
in an
yes.
earlier series on prose, and I shared a few excerpts right now, primarily her letters to Mary Martin, her friend. So that correspondence continued even when she came back, and I think there are about some probably 150 or so, something like that.
That's remarkable.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
All this really kind of leads us to really contextualize Toru Dutt's poetry within this context. So, for example, if you look at the since we are doing the Casuarina tree in detail. So, in the last part, she says that dearer than life to me, alas, were they. Mayst thou be numbered when my days are done with deathless trees like those in Borrowdale, under whose awful branches lingered pale, fear trembling, hope and death the skeleton, and time the shadow, and the weak the verse, that would thy beauty fain, O fain rehearse, may love defend thee from oblivion's curse. Now, we've discussed the imagery
What
quite
is the
a
message
bit.
that she is
So,
getting across through Casuarina tree?
So I think it's primarily her reminiscing the time that she has actually spent and what she's seeing in England. It's both things at the same time. But what is very striking about this last part is also a note of melancholy that is there, which I think is very striking for this very young girl, and who's writing poetry, but is talking about her her childhood days spent under the casuarina tree, and she's also talking about deathless trees like those in Borrowdale, and there is this very strong melancholic note that one sees towards the end of our casuarina tree.
One can see, some kind of a Matthew Arnold, who is a contemporary.
Which is where the entire Victorian tradition, as you pointed out, that also kind of comes in, and
Lower Beach, that poem, that seems to live in this particular poem.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the critics says that contextualizes that's what Gibson calls the metropolitan and colonial triangulations of English, French, and Indian nations, and through Dutt's poetic revisions of the tradition of poetic piety. So
Would you comment on triangulation? It's a new word I've heard.
I found that very interesting because
Yes.
Toru Dutt's writing actually brings together the three of course don't meet, and England and France being rivals at that time as colonizers, I must say.
So French,
And
English, and India. These
yes,
are the
yes, these are the
three angles of
three
the triangle.
three angles of the triangle. So I thought that was very interesting, and of course the critic also talks about how Dutt is able to refashion the Christian tropes, here, allowing multiple languages, locations, and ideological claims to compete with each other. So I think if today we look at post-colonial theory, we go back to this, and all this is from Alison Chapman's article. So we go back to this and we realize that to talk about uh, you know from a post-colonial perspective, to talk about post-coloniality with respect to Toru Dutt's writing, it's important to kind of give the space that she herself does in her work to the different styles and traditions that kind of influence her. So you have the as Chapman says, Toru Dutt's Indo-Anglo-Franco-cultural, linguistic, and educational hybridity. Hybridity is a very it's a favored word within post-colonial theory. So but the hybridity here is of the Indian, the English, the French, at the same time the cultural, the linguistic, and the educational. And this creates what she calls a kind of third space identity for at the point of cultural crossings for Toru Dutt's writing. And in this sense it becomes a very, very enriching experience. This brings us to another poem by a sonnet by Toru Dutt called Bogmare. Bogmare is the garden. Again, we must note that though there are times when she is very disgusted and disappointed with what she sees around her, in Calcutta, and yet at the same time, it is still a space that she kind of relates to because she belongs to it in a certain sense. So, Bogmare is the sonnet here, and she writes, "A sea of foliage girds our garden round, but not a sea of dull, unvaried green. Sharp contrast of all colours here are seen. The light green, graceful tamarinds abound amid the mango clumps of green profound, and palms arise like pillars grey between, and over the quiet pools the seamals lean, red, red, and startling like a trumpet sound." So, this is just a first part of the sonnet. So, if we look at this, the sea of foliage that is there, the green that one sees around, contrasting colors. There is the tamarind tree, there's a mango tree. So it's something very, very blissful, and she's reminiscing, and she's constantly, even when she's abroad, she thinks about places like Bogmare. So, but nothing, she says, can be lovelier than the ranges of bamboos to the eastward when the moon looks through their gaps and the white lotus changes into a cup of silver. One might swoon drunken with beauty then, or gaze and gaze on a primeval Eden in amaze. So I think the term Eden here brings back both the English and the Christian tradition. So she looks at this as a kind of Edenic space that relates more to her childhood than anything else. So I think with Bogmare, there are a lot of things one need to keep in mind. One, that she's experimenting with the sonnet form, and that she uses, again there is a blend. So a lot of the Indian images that are juxtaposed in terms of structure, in terms of form, in terms of style within the English tradition, and both the romantic and of course as a kind of changing setting in of the Victorian in her writing, and how she finally ends this poem with mention of Eden and the Edenic space that it becomes. And that of course tells us about how she reinforces her identity as somebody who has converted to Christianity, but also something that comes to her from England. So yeah, would you like to
No,
comment
I would
on
like
Bob
to
Marley?
comment on this aspect of romanticism and Garden of Eden and paradise and nature that is around, because this doesn't constitute a very integral part of Christian imagination, which is supposed to be repenting, which is supposed to be going back, which is supposed to be talking about one's own sins, and this person takes pleasure in referring to romantic images, and she falls in love with them. And I don't think she would go back to paradise. She would remain here in the middle of nature, like most of the romantic poets, whose imagination was not Christian at all.
So actually, I think she's
Keats
deliberately
might be born in a Christian family, but he's not a
Yeah.
Christian at heart.
So I think somewhere it becomes important. She's also kind of being somebody who was converted. She's also kind of, in a sense, in her poetry, showing that variation there. So in a sense that she's not going into the Christian tradition of exiting from paradise, but the paradise is in the here and now, which is in Bogmari for
Yes.
her. So I think the comparison is with a biblical concept, and the comparison is that Bogmari for her is, if there is paradise, and it is Bogmari.
An alternative to paradise.
An alternative to paradise. It is there in the here and the now. So she's not going into the whole story about Eden, but she's using that if that is the epitome of perfection, then for her it is Bogmari. So actually she says that in her one of her letters. She says that we all want much to return to England. We miss the free life there. Here we can hardly go out of the limits of our own garden, but Bogmari happily is a pretty big place, and we walk round our own park as much as we like. So, and though of course she associates time and again in her letters, she associates Europe with a certain kind of freedom that she finds missing. But she also yearns for that freedom in her own country. So I think where she's also kind of bringing her knowledge and her awareness. It's interesting how in the 19th century, I think a lot of people, especially who were from the well-off families and got the opportunity to travel abroad to other countries. So they brought back that knowledge, and they brought back that awareness of what was happening in the world. So I think she does the same. So of course, there are these complex positions, and there are multiple points of view that emerge actually in her writing, and where of course she takes on. She is surely well read, so she takes on from the romantics, but of course, as you rightly pointed out, that it is also now that the Victorian age had kind of set in. She also partakes of that. So there is a sense of taking on from these different styles, and more importantly, that here is an Indian woman who's kind of showcasing an exposure of different worlds in her writing.
Now that you mention the Indian woman here, then can you explain it further? Where is the woman in her writing, in her kind of English writing that she is presenting to us? And what is that femininity, or well, I don't call femininity feminism at all, but what I say is that where is present, I'm just presenting a query, asking a query, where exactly is the woman in her writing, so far as her poetry or other writing is concerned?
So actually, when we look at, she's a writer who is kind of experimenting with writing. And when we look at this blend, the triangulation that we talk about, it is the sensitive mind of a very young woman that is kind of, that's the platform on which this is really speaking happening. And this needs to be combined, of course, not just with the poetry. The aspect also emerges in, for instance, her unfinished novel, The Spanish Maiden or Bianca.
And as a woman who is not exposed to social influences, is opening out to the world around her.
For us to expect a kind of 20th century, not even 21st, I'm saying 20th century awareness of what it means to be a woman would be rather unfair. But to accept that here is a young woman who's writing this, I think that is the important takeaway. And for any such reflection of, where, she gives agency to the fact that she's a woman, I think there we have to take it in, tandem with her letters and the novel. So I think that kind of clearly brings out everything.
And
So,
her sense of curiosity, her innocence, and that he's not bothered about asking all those questions that other people, who are conscious about their surroundings would ask. So she's curious about them, and she's honestly, you used the word honest earlier. So this honesty is in my opinion, a kind of a woman surrounded by so many different things.
different things. In fact, we'll come to an entirely different aspect of her poetry soon enough. So, for example, you know, Meenakshi Mukherjee also kind of says that here is her so-called bifurcated identity. He calls it a post-romantic Bengali writer, and how the occupation of what she calls a very hyphenated space becomes the space in which a certain kind of questioning takes place. And Chapman too talks about Dutt's subversions, and a very interesting aspect about the sonnet here. So we, you raise the question about female agency, and how that it's a woman. So within the sonnet, the whole idea is of a in a Petrarchan sonnet, it's not the woman. The woman is there on the pedestal, and it's the speaker is generally male. So, but here, as Chapman very clearly points out, that Dutt's subversions are quite simply radical. For who ever heard of the English poetess blowing her own trumpet, especially in a sonnet form, whose Petrarchanism conventionally silenced women? And yet her radical poetics are also deeply ironic and questioning. The Bogmari sonnet ascribes a transformative agency to the declaration of inherent generic national hybridity. And so, to forge her own space, Chapman says, for a new Indo-European contact zone, a space of contrast that is open, variegated, and of course it connotes the etymology of the final word, amaze. There's bewilderment, and there's puzzlement, and there's wonder. So, we were talking about different aspects of her writing, and we come to a ballad. Now, she's written a ballad on Lakshman. Of course, the book is titled Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan. So, the moment of the whole concept of the Lakshman Rekha, where Sita compels Lakshman to go and look for Ram. So that is very beautifully expressed in a ballad. And here, we see a shift of an entirely different kind of writing, though of course again the style is something that she takes from the English. For example, if you look at just a few lines of the ballad Lakshman, hark Lakshman, hark again that cry. It is my husband's voice, O hasten to his succor fly, no more hast thou, dear friend, a choice. So, the structure is, structurally we're looking at a very, very English concept, and yet the ballad is about, Lakshman and Sita. It's a conversation between the two. So, this is an entirely different aspect of Toru Dutt's poetry. So, would you like to comment on, her writing of the ballad Lakshman? I thought it was quite interesting that
first
she is
thing
also,
is that she's picking up an episode from Indian folklore, and she's internalizing it, and she's writing about it, and she's taking a position, and that shows that she doesn't have a prejudice against or in favor of anything.
Yes.
She's a very honest onlooker, and whatever registers in her mind, she talks about it, and talks in very sensitive terms. So here also, when she sees the long English tradition, then she goes back to the Ramayana, connected with Ramayana folklore, and that is very Indian also, because the people in our epics are very close to nature, and through nature about even gods, but those gods are gods of nature generally, and they have assumed a human form, and they come, and Ram is a kind of a god, who in a human form, but otherwise he is a part of divinity. So that is, and that takes her to the ancient European idea also. So I think Hindustan and the ancient world of the western part, all that is finding a space in her poetic imagination, and that's what matters.
Yes. So I think with Toru Dutt we've covered a very, very long span where we've looked at a little bit about her letters. We've looked at a beautiful poem, Casuarina Tree, and there's the sonnet Bogmari, and I think that's a very important takeaway, that the sonnet, when it emerges from the Petrarchan tradition, it's just totally turned around, and whether she's doing it absolutely consciously or it's just it is a very young, fertile, creative and honest mind that is pouring forth. And as Professor Prakash rightly said, that she's not prejudiced about any tradition. She is that a very, very sharp observer who's absorbing different traditions, the triangulation that we really spoke about. So similarly in this ballad, at how one point Sita tells Lakshman that hasten to his succor fly, it's, and she asks Lakshman pointedly that why standest thou as magic bound, why aren't you going to go and rescue him? And so she says that the man to whom all looked at need, is it my brother that I see? And finally, Lakshman is compelled, and calls her the Videhan queen. So she writes, "O calm thyself, Videhan queen, no cause is there for any fear." And much as he says that he doesn't want to go, he finally there is also that Lakshman Rekha episode in this, and he finally goes. And so this, of course, the association with Indian folklore, and but what is striking here is the use of terms like hark and thou. So all these words, of course, are coming from the English tradition. So I think if we talk about Indian English writing, in fact, pre-Indian English writing, the coming together of these different traditions, and in her case, not just the English, but also the French and the Indian. And we probably don't know much about the way in which the French tradition would have influenced her, considering that she also writes, she translates a lot of poets, French poets, into English, and also writes the journal. So I think it's fascinating to look at Toru Dutt's poetry in terms of the time period in which it was being written, to which she belongs. So I think that
but there are some fresh ideas also, like picking up from Ramayana or Ramcharitmanas, or Ramayana particularly, the character of Lakshman, who is in the background, who's never been allowed by poets to come forward and take his own position, or being questioned by somebody else. And actually in Hindi, this kind of a thing occurred only in the early 20th century, when Lakshman's wife became the center of attraction for a poet like Mahasi Gupta.
Yes.
So maybe she is a forerunner of that tradition also, where she will pick up some character out of her own imagination based on Indian folklore.
And if one reads the ballad, then she completely argues it out with Lakshman and compels him and says that no, nothing doing, you just have to go. And so it's not just Lakshman, Sita is also getting a voice. Today, of course, there's the whole Sitayana tradition, but in the 19th century, to actually give this kind of voice to Sita, where she's being assertive and is actually, and there's it's a longish
and
ballad.
Ram is not there.
Ram is not there, and it's a longish ballad. And in fact, at one point, if I may just quote this from the ballad, she says that, "O shame, and canst thou make my weal a plea for lingering? Now I know what thou art, Lakshman, and I feel far better were an open foe." So she says that, I'd rather be with an enemy because you're not listening to me.
Thinking Sita.
Yes. This is the thinking Sita, this is the arguing Sita.
Yes.
And so he's compelled, he finally says that, "Well, that with an arrow I trace a magic circle ere I leave. No evil thing within this space may come to harm thee or to grieve. Step not for aught across the line." And then Lakshman also says that, that he does not want to do this, but because he's being compelled, so he says that, I forgive you for everything, before I leave, because he says that he doesn't want to go because he's been instructed to stay back. So and that's how. So what is very clear is that Toru Dutt has certainly lent her own to the folklore, and she's not just taking it as. And she's also, in a sense, she's picked up an episode. So there's a process of selection there. She's read something, she's picked up an episode, and she's developing it further.
So in half a minute, how do you conclude the discussion about Toru Dutt?
I think Toru Dutt's poetry is, in one line, just a very fascinating journey through different traditions, different conventions, and she takes us on a journey right from, Europe to India. So I think that's and a woman writing in the 19th century in English, I think it's very important.
So, with this very rich fare of ideas about 19th century Indian English writing, we come to the end of our discussion. And viewers, just think about these questions that Dr. Payal Nagpal has raised in this discussion, and it opens up lots of associations which otherwise have remained hidden in the background. So, just think about these things, and thank you, Professor Payal Nagpal, for giving this kind of interpretation.
Thank you, Professor Prakash.
So, it's over. Thank you.